make this bracelet, you'll need wire. We have two kinds of wire here. They're both kind of a gold look, but one of them's thicker, it's 22 gauge, and the other one's a little bit thinner, it's 26 gauge. We have a nice big gemstone. This is a faceted gemstone, it's beautiful. And the important thing about picking your stone is to make sure that your bigger wire, which is the 22 gauge, fits through this stone. If it doesn't, you could either find a different stone or you could go up to 24 gauge on your wire. We also have a clasp here. This is a two-part clasp. It's got a little loop at one side and then this hook, and it's in gold to match our wire. And then we've got some leather cording. The leather cording is kind of a dark brown. And for tools, we need round nose pliers and wire cutters. To get started, we're going to cut a piece of wire, and this is the 22 gauge wire, the thicker wire. And we want a piece about 4 or 5 inches long. I'm just eyeballing that. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a little loops on the side of the gemstone so we can attach the leather to it. So to do that, we want to start by making a wrapped loop in one end. This is not as hard as it sounds. I'm going to take the round nose pliers, and I'm just leaving about 1.5 inches of the wire here. I'm going to bend a 90-degree turn in the wire. I'm going to reposition my pliers to the top of that bend. And where I make this next move determines how big the loop is going to be, because I'm going to wrap this wire around the top of the pliers here. If I wrap down here at the end, I'll have a very small loop, but the leather's a little bit big, so I'm going to move to the bigger part of the wires to make the loop a little bit bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend the wire almost all the way around that jaw, and then I'm going to slide the pliers out and put the bottom jaw in there so I can continue to wrap that around. So you can see that that size of that loop is the size of the part of the pliers that I twisted it on. Now I'm going to hold that loop crossways with the round nose pliers, and I'm going to take the short tail and I'm just going to wrap it around the neck here 2 times. So that's 1 and 2. And now we're going to trim it. And you might think that it's a waste to trim this much wire off, but it's really hard to make those wraps if you don't have this long tail. So you need to use that long tail, and don't worry about losing that little extra piece of wire. This isn't expensive wire. So I'm just trimming close to the project there, and then I'm going to straighten that out a little bit. So there's my loop with my 2 wraps, and now I can feed on the gemstone. And I tested the wire before to make sure it would go through the gemstone. If yours doesn't, you can get 24 gauge wire instead. So we have a wrapped loop on one side already, and we're going to match that on this side. To do that, I'm going to take the round nose pliers again, and I'm going to pinch just a tiny bit above the end of the gemstone. So I've got this gemstone pushed tightly up against this end, and I'm going to repeat what I did before. I'm going to make a 90-degree turn. I'm going to reposition the pliers. I'm going to try to guess and get at the same size I did for this other loop, which I think was about here. I bend this wire all the way around almost, and then just slide the pliers out and put the bottom jaw in there so I can continue to slide that loop around. So now I've got a complete loop there. I'm going to hold the loop crossways, and I'm going to make 2 wraps just like we did before. 1 and 2. And now I'm going to trim just like we did before with the wire cutters. And I can save this piece of wire for another project if I want, but let me tell you, it was not expensive wire. So we've got our loops on either side and with our little wraps, and then I'm just going to use the pliers to kind of make those even. If your tail that you just trimmed is sticking up a little bit, you can use the pliers to mash that down. And that's how we'll make the gemstone stay on the bracelet. Now that we have our gemstone ready and it has these little connectors on it, we need to attach the leather cording. And what we're going to do is cut a piece of leather cording 2 times the length of a bracelet. So I'm going to go around my wrist 1 time and around again 2 times, like that. That'll be plenty of this leather cording. And I'm just going to use the wire cutters to cut that. And now what we're going to do is cut this in half, because the way this bracelet is constructed, we have a piece on one side and a piece on the other. And if I fold it in half and cut it here, I will have 2 pieces that are both long. And don't worry about this bends in this, it'll stretch out as we work with it. So now I've got one of the pieces of leather cording here. Move that out of the way. And I'm going to feed it through the loop we made in the gemstone here. And I'm going to line the ends up here and pull it. Line that up a little better. And then pull it. That's going to be one side. So now we want to secure this leather next to the gemstone using some of this thinner wire. This is the 26 gauge wire. It's thinner. And I'm going to cut a piece about 4 or 5 inches. And what we want to do is wrap it around the leather here next to the gemstone. And to do that, I'm going to grab the tail of the wire there just to hold it. And I'm going to start wrapping. I'm going to start wrapping out a little bit far away from the gem so that as I make the wraps and they come closer to the gem, they still leave some of the leather showing. So I'm going to go around the 2 pieces of leather there. The first loop you make, or first wrap you make, is the hardest one to get going. But now I've got that on there. And I'm going to do 5 wraps. And I just want to make the wraps as close together as I can. Kind of push them together. I'm just wrapping it with my fingers. Pretty easy. 5. And that's going to secure that leather up there next to the gemstone. I'm going to cut the tail of the wire with a little extra here so I can tuck it in between these leather pieces so it doesn't stick out and hurt us. And so I'm just tucking it in there, and I can just use my pliers here to push that wire down closer to the wraps. That's tucked in there nicely. And I can push my wraps together too a little bit. And then I'm going to cut the other one and do the same with this side. I'm going to pull that wire out. I'm going to cut it with a little piece of tail there. And then I think I'll put this tail on this side. This side's easier because I can just open the leather up and tuck it in between like that. So this is our gemstone with the leather on one side. And now we're just going to repeat to do the same thing on the other side with the other piece that we cut. So just like I did before, I pulled the leather through the loop on the gemstone, made it so it was even, and then I'm going to cut a piece of the 26 gauge wire, 4 or 5 inches long, and I'm going to wrap it around the leather. So I'm going to grab about 1 inch of it there. I want to line it up so when I make these wraps, they're about the same distance that the other side are from, these wraps are from the gemstone. So I'm just going to pay attention to where I begin wrapping. So I think that looks about right. And there's one wrap. Put that gemstone out of the way. Pull it kind of tight. There's my second wrap. Wrap that around. And we did 5 wraps. So we want to do the same on both sides. And those look about even. That's good. And then just like we did before, I'm going to scrunch those together. The wire's pretty soft, so you can just kind of bend it together. And then I'm going to cut with a little tail there so that I can tuck that tail in. You could also cut it flush, and if it isn't poking you, that's fine. And if you cut it flush enough, it won't poke. But this is just an extra trick so that you won't have any pokey pieces. And I'm going to do the same on this side. Actually, I'll just show you on this side. If you wanted to just cut it flush and not tuck it, I would suggest cutting it close to the center of the 2 leather pieces so that you can just push it down a little bit. And that might be easier. So now we've got our 2 sides secured like that, looking beautiful. And then all we need to do now is put on the clasp. Now that we have our band on the gemstone, we're ready to put on the clasp. And what we want to do is measure how big we want the bracelet. When we initially cut the leather, we just guessed that it was going to be about 2 times, we would need leather about 2 times the length of a bracelet. But now I want to be more precise, and what I've done is I've picked out a bracelet from our collection, and this is a length that we like. So I'm going to put the clasps on the leather at the same location. So here's our clasp, and what we want to do is take the 2 ends now of the leather and feed them both through the clasp. The clasp has a loop on the end here. I'm going to feed both pieces through there. When you pick out a clasp, you'll want to pick out a clasp that you can feed both pieces of leather through. So there's both pieces of leather, and if I center this like the bracelet above it, I can see that I want this clasp to be about here, and I want to make sure I have enough room on this side to make this long enough. I think what I'm going to do is pull it out a little bit like that. I'm going to put the clasp here and the loop here. So I'm going to fold the leather back on itself at that location. I'm pinching it together so I have the right length. And now we're going to secure it the same way we did before. We're going to cut a piece of wire. I should have cut the wire before because now I have one hand to do it, but I can do it. We cut a piece about 4 inches like we did before. And we're going to wrap it like we did before. I'm going to hold it with one hand that's holding the leather, and I'm going to wrap it just like we did before. And we're going to do this pretty tight because this is actually going to secure the clasp. This other set of wraps that we did, that just held the leather together, but it's not holding the bracelet together. These wraps are actually going to hold the bracelet together. So I'm going to do 5, and then I'm going to see if I think that feels secure enough. And yeah, that feels pretty good. So now we're going to cut it just like we did before. I'm going to trim the wire here close where I can tuck that little end in between the leather, and I'm going to trim the same on the other side there. And then I can use those round nose pliers that we used before for the wrapped loops to just tuck that little end in between the leather bands there. And then you can trim this leather a little shorter if you want. I think it would be nice kind of closer to the wraps. So I'm going to go up a little bit closer to the wraps, but not all the way to the wraps, and just cut those ends a little bit. So that's how one side is done with the clasp. And then to do the other side, I'm going to take the other end of the clasp, which has been hanging around on there this whole time. It's a little loop. I have to edit this part out. There's the little loop. And I'm going to put the little loop on the other end just the same way. So I'm going to measure again. Here's our clasp next to clasp, bracelet next to bracelet, lining it up, going out to the end here. This is where we want our loop, so it matches the length of this bracelet here. So I'm just going to hold that with my fingers and feed both ends through this loop. And again, you'll want to make sure that both sides of your clasp, you can feed these 2 pieces of leather through at the same time. So there's my leather through the end of the clasp, and I'm just going to fold that back on itself like I did before. And again, I forgot to cut the wire, but that's okay. I grab the wire and cut another piece about 4 inches long. There's the end. And you can see I'm cutting the wire a little extra long, longer than it needs to be. It's so much easier to work with wire and wrap it when you have longer tails. So don't worry about it being too long or that you're cutting too much off. And now I'm going to stick the wire like we did before, pinch it with the leather, and do my wraps. I'm doing 5 wraps again, nice and tight. Pull the first one back tight there and moosh them together. And then trim like we did before, close to the project, but don't cut your project. I'm going to tuck that little wire in. And if you want to make it so the wire's really tucked in, you can do it the way I did on the side of the gemstone, where I cut a little longer tail and tucked it in using the pliers. You remember when I did that, I just tucked that in like that. And now I want to trim the leather end here, like we did the other side. And there's that side. And get rid of all our little extra wires or other bracelets so I can show you how this looks. We have our 2 pieces of leather coming off the gemstone, and we've got this nice little wrap here and here to hold it, and then we can clasp by putting that hook through the ring. Isn't that pretty?